Strange women lying in ponds, distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
But what if it was? Let's talk about Worldbuilding Monarchies. And you can get today's sponsor that I use, Dashlane, for 30 days free over at www.dashlane.com/hellofutureme. Links are all down below. We're going to be getting into all of this today, which is a lot, so let's just jump into it. Part 1. Types of monarchy. There are kinda two different types of monarchy, and they arise from different economic, political, and cultural environments. You can have succession monarchs, where a relative of the current monarch takes the crown after them, and though you're likely familiar with Patrilineal Primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits it all, which relative is chosen often differs from system to system. I've got a lot of them up on the screen now. A successive monarchy usually arises from a single family controlling A, population centres, and B, important resources, not necessarily the largest swath of land, though they often did, because historically, controlling large swaths of land meant controlling resources. Consider this map of Norway in 930 CE. Harold controlled almost the smallest portion of Norwegian land, but all of the main population centres and much of the fishing trade with the rest of Scandinavia. The imbalance of power here allowed Harold to exert force on those around him and enforce a successive monarchy. But the question of who inherits the throne in a successive monarchy is characterised by a mix of social and cultural norms. The emphasis on male succession in most cultures is deeply rooted in the traditional male role of being a warrior, politically required for leadership in the past. In contrast, some southwestern areas of Japan practiced ultimogeniture in the Edo period, where the youngest son, not the eldest, inherits the most, or at least inherits the heart of it. This was because of a cultural norm that valued caring for the elderly, which the youngest child would be the one left doing. Perhaps in your world, only females can do something incredibly important to leadership in your world. #women can be dictators too. Or the religious value of older age means that it passes to the eldest sibling, regardless of their gender. Consider what societal pressures or cultural norms may change what leadership requires in your world, and thus, to whom succession would pass. In particular, things like magic systems, technology, and advanced social structures act as equalizers between the sexes, ages, or anyone else, even making them fitter for the throne. The world-building question for you is which factors in your world act as equalizers for people, or change what is required of a leader, thus changing how succession should work. Alternatively, you could have the second type, elective monarchies.
You don't vote for kings?
Where a body elects an individual, usually from amongst themselves, to become High King or King. They will usually serve for life, though not always, and then a new king's moot will be called to pick the next one. The Vatican is probably the most famous example of this. The Pope is voted in by cardinals in a long, very complex procession. However, and this is important to know, an elective monarchy doesn't mean that hereditary claims mean nothing. Many successive monarchies begin as elective monarchies and then evolve. The Holy Roman Empire, the Bohemians, and the Dutch may have elected their kings, but it was nearly always from among a single family with far more influence than the rest of the electors. Truly elective monarchies did not last very long, as being in a position of executive power allowed the family to acquire immense influence and wealth, eventually allowing them to emerge as the most powerful faction, ensuring their heirs' election, making the election more of a rubber stamp. In that case, it becomes more of a tradition in a successive monarchy than its own system. There are lots of questions about how they elected and who by, but the bigger world-building question for you is what keeps your elective monarchy from devolving into a hereditary one? Perhaps there are some of the democratic checks and balances that we have today, term limits, that being a king means you don't own land and wealth, or maybe candidates for kings have to be sterile or gay. The Ottoman Empire, Vietnamese dynasty, and Chinese dynasties all gave a lot of political power to eunuchs who couldn't have children because they believed them less vulnerable to corruption and seduction. Otherwise, it could be wholly different and random. It can be whatever you want.
We're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week.
Perhaps candidates are trialed against one another, Hunger Games style, like they are in Jenna Morici's The Saviour's Champion. Or there's a certain set of character criteria, like for how they find the next Dalai Lama, a religious leader. See, the role of succession isn't just about who is king, but it's about preventing civil war in disputes over who should be king. It's about continuity of government. If the conflict is likely to come from within the family, then a blood-related succession is probably better fit. But if it's likely to come from houses challenging the throne, then maybe an elective monarchy. Ask yourself where the conflict in succession is most likely to come from. But thirdly, whether successive, elective, or something else, constitutionalism is asking whether there is a legal agreement with any other body limiting the powers of the monarch. Now, the degree to which your monarch is restrained will entirely depend on your society, being anywhere from near absolutism to merely ceremonial, but constitutional monarchies are often paired with a comparative rising economic quality, a merchant class, and a shrinking peasant class. See, the spread of wealth, often coupled with an industrial revolution creating more skilled workers, means that a significant class of people are educated and can demand more of a say, leading to a constitutional agreement. Though there are examples like the Magna Carta that show it can happen long before that. Point is, if there is a constitutional agreement, then there's going to be a social economic context that it comes from usually. The world-building questions for you are A. What are the interests of the group that bind the monarch? For example, the glorious English Revolution of 1688 was partly motivated by Protestants seeking to restrain an ardently Catholic monarch, King James. This led to the constitutional right of Protestants to bear arms for their defence suitable to their conditions, and preventing the establishment of ecclesiastical courts designed to punish those against Catholicism. And B. Which powers matter in your society? Historically, focus has been on the powers of legislation, judicial jurisdiction, the courts, taxation, and control of the military. These are kind of the pillars of governmental powers, but some countries had restrictions over the appointment of religious authorities, for example, the distribution of land, or even the right to organize labor unions in Russia following the 1905 revolution. Which rights, powers, or liberties are crucial to how your society works? It could be anything, in which case, it's likely these would factor into constitutional agreements. Part 2. De jure versus de facto power. The question of world building is just as much how is power legally divided as it is how is power factually divided. A state may be a monarchy of some kind, but the actual web of power behind it may lie somewhere else. The Prince of Pentos in A Song of Ice and Fire is a de jure, by law, elected monarch, but the real power rests in the hands of a small number of nobles called magisters, making it a de facto aristocratic monarchy. Alternatively, the real power could be in the hands of the wealthy, like the Empire of Japan prior to World War II, making it a plutocratic monarchy. The Earth Kingdom in Avatar: The Last Airbender is a bureaucratic monarchy, where legally the power lies in the hands of the king, but the real power lies in the hands of the bureaucracy surrounding him. Other dynamics include stratocratic monarchies like the Roman Empire, technocratic monarchies, which may work for those in science fiction, theocratic monarchies, or even magicratic monarchies where wizards hold the real power in fantasy. Having a combination of 2 or 3 systems of government creates a really interesting de jure de facto dynamic to explore, and adds an extra layer of complexity to your world because power structures are almost never as simple as the de jure way it looks. Consider how your democracy is meant to work versus where you feel it may be biased and towards whom. I'll just leave that question hanging. But in designing this, you can't just pick whichever ones you want in world building. The question of de jure and de facto power will be closely linked to social structure and the economic system of your society. In Dragon Age, the Archon may be the usually hereditary monarchical figure of the Tevinter Imperium, but it's a strict racial class system, with elves being viewed as racially inferior, as well as a magical hierarchy above that. It is also a slave-based economy, and while the Archon may be the legal head of it all, a majority of the workforce, resources, and wealth through slave ownership is controlled by other powerful human mages, making the state a monarchic magocracy. A war economy will have a strong relationship with a de facto stratocratic leadership. A communist social structure will have strong de facto working class representatives behind the throne. If there is an aristocracy that somehow survived the glorious revolution, a strong capitalist economy would have CEOs who own massive companies that control more resources and more of the workforce than the monarch perhaps. The world building question is this: a monarchy may be at the heart of your society, but how is the workforce, the wealth, the resources, and the social capital organized in the rest of society? That will tell you who is de facto in charge. See, the fundamental fact behind all of this is that even absolutist monarchies are never truly absolute. Monarchs exist at the center of a web of power, but that web around them is made out of businessmen, nobles, family members, the military, academics, the church, and so much more depending on your world. Mad King Ares II in A Song of Ice and Fire, the Mad King, was really being kept in power by the smart politicking of Tywin Lannister. And when Tywin decided to switch sides, that was when he truly lost. Even without a constitution, monarchies will always be restricted by the conventions and wishes of those who keep them in power. I really recommend watching CGP Grey's Rules for Rulers, it's linked up in the corner, goes into a bit more of this. Part 3. Communication, control, and commerce. I talked about the importance of these 3 C's in ruling in a lot more detail in my videos on empires, also linked up in the corner, but they are relevant to all governing structures, and to monarchs in some specific ways that we'll cover today. Communication is how quickly information can be relayed between the central authority and its provinces. The more quick and detailed it is, the more power a monarch has to rule. The challenges of a pre-modern setting are obvious. To address this, some monarchs historically developed itinerant royal courts, ones that moved throughout the country. Emperor Henry VI travelled more than 4,000 kilometers in 1193 across Germany. This means that communication doesn't create so much of a barrier for ruling, as they can place themselves wherever they are needed most. The Mongolian monarch established the Ortu in the 1200s, a system of 14,000 or more checkpoints with horses and shelter that allowed messengers to easily travel 20 to 30 miles a day across the vast kingdom. In Sanderson's The Way of Kings, the communication barrier is overcome through magic with the use of span reeds, which are a comparatively fast way of transmitting large amounts of information across great distances, allowing a high level of direct control. Necessarily, monarchs in modern or futuristic settings will not likely face these same challenges. Control is how easy it is for the monarch to exert influence over a particular region, both in speed and level of force. It's not quite as easy to just say, "I am your king." In my videos on empires, I define control as really asking, why do people remain as part of the state? This is another reason that some early monarchies held itinerant courts. The early Egyptian dynastic court held the following of Horus, where they travelled about the country to not only be more visible to subjects, but to help them exert influence directly over the lower class and the outer regions, not just vicariously through the upper class, empowering themselves and depowering those directly beneath them. But monarchs have a characteristic way of maintaining control, and we gotta talk about that. The system of patronage. This is basically what rewards and punishment the monarch gives, not only to ensure loyalty to the crown, but to maintain the power of the crown. Conventionally, these are giving or taking titles, lands, economic rights, government positions, or status in the royal court. For example, the Qing dynasty granted the right to wear peacock feathers, a complex and important symbol in Chinese mythology and religion. Your system of patronage, though, will be closely tied to the economic and social systems of your world. Because European feudal power was largely based on land ownership, the system of patronage was significantly tied to giving land to those who supported the monarch or taking it away. Elizabeth I rewarded subjects with the loan of important lands, but retained ownership to maintain the land power of the crown. A futuristic society, though, may be basing the system of patronage on data ownership or technology rights as they grow in value and importance in this day. I could imagine a monarch in an altered carbon type world where you live forever by putting your mind into a new body, punishing people by removing their ability to do so, taking away their discs. At the heart of the system of patronage, the world-building question for you is, what is valuable and what is punishing in your society? While you can use the conventional stuff, and that's totally okay, consider finding something unique that sets your system of patronage apart as well, just to give your monarchy a unique feel. But to bring control and communication together, the thing is, historically, monarchs dealt with communication issues and maintained control by making it so that they didn't have to. They would promote people they trusted and demote people they didn't. This way, A, they didn't need to maintain direct communication with all provinces to rule them all directly all the time, and B, they weren't worried about losing control because people they trusted were in power. The strategy necessarily became a lot more difficult when democratic or constitutional norms arose, but also when other power structures challenged them, particularly religious ones. The investiture controversy started a struggle between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry VI in 1076 over who could appoint bishops, which held considerable land and power. The world-building questions for you are A, who does the monarch trust and not trust to maintain their power, and B, which democratic or constitutional norms or power structures make this strategy more difficult, thus depowering the monarch, or at least complicating the web of power around them. Lastly, commerce. See, commerce is a crucial factor in the stability of a state, monarchy or not, and it's important to understand how your king interacts with the economy, making it better or worse. They tended to stop itinerant moving courts and create fixed capital cities as financial centers to the country developed, though they usually resisted at first, as it meant recognizing the power of a growing merchant class. Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople not only for security reasons, but because Rome was declining as an economic center while Constantinople now controlled the masses of Black Sea trade. Now, there isn't that much to say about specific policies that monarchs employed that other systems of government didn't, with the exception of three things: mercantilism, tax, and patronage. Mercantilism is an economic theory that's wrong. It developed in the waning years of monarchical power and partly evolved as a method of indirectly retaining power. Eli Heckscher, an economic historian, detailed that mercantilism revealed a fairly uniform conception of general social phenomena in the field of economics, that all interests were to be made obedient to the monarch as the embodiment of the state. It was a semi-planned economy that discouraged imports and maximized exports, with the monarch largely determining what should be made, sold, and bought for supposedly the good of the country, but really the good of them. Mercantilism did not work and is one of the hallmarks of waning monarchical power, hurting commerce and actually eventually leading to market liberation that accompanied the depowering or even overthrow of monarchs throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. If your monarchy is declining in power, then perhaps a good way to reflect this is with attempts at mercantilism. Secondly, while who and what is taxed varies radically across history, what does remain true is that monarchies tend to be, well, they're really petty. In 1705, Emperor Peter the Great of Russia taxed beards because he wanted people to look more like Western Europe. Come on, please, we're just like you. Oliver Cromwell taxed the royalists, his political enemies, just an extra 10% to piss them off. The reason is that unitary powers like monarchs are more subject to personal whims. There's not as much to stop them. It's not uncommon for the crown to monopolize specific resources like gemstones or peacocks were in the Han Dynasty, which go on to be symbols of prestige and power. The question is, if your monarch has powers of taxation, what less rational ways might the tax system be set up? Thirdly, monarchs would often grant economic boons as part of the system of patronage, often in the form of monopolies, and these were greatly sought after because they made you rich. Elizabeth I temporarily improved the English economy by granting patent monopolies for new inventions, which is similar to what we do today. But monopolies soon became so unrestricted and so common that there were harmful consequences that became a serious grievance under the harsh economic conditions of the 1590s, for by the licenses, a few were enriched and the multitude impoverished. Fundamentally, which economic rights are sought after and given will sharply reflect what is monetarily valuable in your society. So don't just think of, resources or whatever. In Frank Herbert's Dune, this was the spice resource in particular, which has a really unique role in the story. In Blade Runner, this was the production of androids, the Tyrell Corporation has a monopoly on. But the granting of monopolies can undermine the economy. That is important to understand. Consider which, say, 5 major resources or products would be most in demand in your world, and how the monarch uses economic patronage to interfere with their supply, demand, and cost. Part 4. The Royal Court. If a monarch is influential in your story, some kind of royal court will likely be an important setting where major characters interact and big story beats happen. So it's important to be creative or get it right. Understand that royal courts are not just a European thing. It's not just European traditions like you've seen in A Game of Thrones. Arabic, Asiatic, European, and even African royal courts worked vastly different to one another in the 4 Ps: praxis, power structures, positions, and purposes. Praxis is just the word I'm using for traditions because I liked the idea of calling it the 4 Ps. The Japanese imperial court had a tradition of saibara songs, which came from songs sung by those transporting tribute to the Kyoto capital in the past, signifying the importance of this procession in their culture and history. We might understand traditional titles like Duke, Baron, and Mr. Tibbles maybe to be hereditary, but in the Qing dynasty, titles were often downgraded with every generation, placing emphasis on how far removed you were by bloodline from the person who earned it. See, traditions in royal court that you know of come from historical realities which may not exist in your world, so simply transplanting the 1577 French court into your book can be, well, unrealistic. Now, when considering power structures, there will be factions within the royal court vying for power. The question is, who will these be and what are their interests? And this can be weird and wonderful in your fictional world, coming from any number of societal, economic, religious, or otherwise backgrounds, not just wanting money or land. Take how the eunuchs were often an incredibly important class in the Ottoman, Vietnamese, and particularly Chinese imperial courts, where they would interfere with the line of succession and did even appoint themselves as regent rulers. The Janissaries, the royal bodyguards of the Ottoman Empire, had a massive and complex role to play. I really suggest you go and read up about what they did and who they were. Likewise, positions in the royal court usually reflect the power structures within the wider state, as monarchs wish to keep powerful influences nearby. In the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, the Merlin's seat is a powerful female mage, such that all royal courts basically have a position for her advisors, whose authority is almost never questioned. Her position and power reflects who wields power in the wider society. And lastly, let's talk about purpose, the purpose of the royal court. It may focus or at least lean on 1 or 2 areas. The Imperial Chinese court of the Ming dynasty focused on military and ceremonial matters because they had a complex bureaucracy to deal with the rest, while the Ottoman royal court placed emphasis on religious issues, with important positions to denote this because of its theocratic tendencies. Or maybe your court stays away from religious issues, like some European powers did when the church was incredibly powerful. Now, these are generalizations, but the interests of the royal court often lean into particular areas that arise from the society of the day, and it'd be interesting to see how your royal court reflects that. To build on this will become more limited, as in their focus will become more limited as it becomes more constitutional and they lose more power, leading them to more ceremonial roles, like Part 5, How Monarchies Collapse. Eventually, all heads roll, including the monarch, and especially if you're French. See, a monarchy is overthrown much the same way that any government is, so I'm going to focus on where it's different to how other government structures collapse. We tend to focus on how monarchy declines under the rise of democratic power, because that's kind of the world we're in, but this isn't necessarily the case. In 1939, Italy invaded and abolished the Albanian monarchy, but they were ruled by Benito Mussolini, a fascist. Before then, dozens of African monarchies were virtually wiped out during the colonial era, and while this was by semi-democratic powers, they were placed under a dictatorial rule, and it was done primarily for economic gain, not truly liberating them. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church toppled dozens of petty kings and lords as their theocratic power rivaled their own. Point is, monarchies are overthrown when it's advantageous for competing powers to do so. It's not necessarily democratic or liberating. But monarchies, being elevated figures accustomed to wealth, worship, and symbolic importance, often did fight against growing constitutional and democratic norms. The Norwegian king, the British queen, the Danish king, the Swedish king, the Japanese emperor, the Tongan king, Thai king, and many others were all those who adjusted to new constitutional demands and divested their powers. Those that didn't, or didn't do it quick enough in the case of Tsar Nicholas, got lined up against the wall for the most part. No matter what period, futuristic, ancient, modern, or pre-modern your book is based in, there will be tension between the monarch's powers and another group, whoever that is for your society. Consider who has which powers they will contest, and where that relationship is heading, getting worse, getting better, or on the brink of collapse. If your story is about the collapse of a monarchy, then this tension will likely be a long-term causal factor in why. But more importantly here, study how real-world monarchies survived and failed. It's so much more complex than I am able to get into, and they will be a better resource than I could ever be. But I want to talk about a world-building trope that isn't so great. See, the collapse of a monarchy doesn't mean that the current monarch was specifically terrible. King Louis XVI of France was the monarch at the time of the French Revolution, but he actually attempted numerous reforms to be a little more democratic and transparent. The problem was more with the nobility around him, and being a symbolic figurehead of the aristocracy, blame was put onto him and he was a figurehead no more. Not even a head anymore. Monarchies exist at the heart of complex systems, and sometimes cannot truly control them nor stop them. The collapse will happen regardless of what they do. And a big part of the collapse of many monarchies is in tradition. Monarchies are big, bloated, elaborate systems that are very difficult to change. And even though the economic, cultural, and social norms, the power structures of the wider society may change, that doesn't mean that the monarchy itself will actually reflect that. For example, let's take the world building of an elective monarchy. The question of who elects the monarch is an important question to ask. And while we would expect this to be based on who is powerful in society, who is powerful doesn't stay the same, it changes. Though not an elective monarchy, take the House of Lords in the UK. It's made up of clergymen, nobles, and others who don't really have any power anymore, not truly at least, yet they are part of this elective representative body. The point is that how the monarchy works may reflect how things were in the past, but are not necessarily now, as these kind of large structures take a lot more time to change than I think society often does. A good example of this is that now many monarchies allow the eldest child to ascend to the throne, regardless of whether they are a man or a woman, but that change only happened once the women's rights movement had really been in full swing for a long time. So when world building your monarchy, don't just ask how things work now in your society, but ask how they worked in the past, and how much of a dissonance there is between those two things. And this is relevant to how monarchies collapse because I think that when there's a real dissonance between those two things, between how the monarchy works and how society actually works, how those powers are set up, that it can lead to tension between those two sides, to instability even if the monarch holds a lot of power. And that really leads us on to part 6, a good kingdom a good king make not.
I am the king!
This is a really common world building pitfall. There's a good quote from Martin on Tolkien's world building. Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy, that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at history and it's not that simple. What was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? If your kingdom is unstable, then it's almost never simply just because he was a bad monarch. And if your kingdom was prosperous, it's almost never just because they were a good monarch, and certainly not because they were just moral. If your kingdom is unstable, then it's almost never just because they were a bad monarch. And if your kingdom is prosperous, it's almost never just because they were a good monarch, certainly not because they were moral. That's actually the point of Daenerys' storyline. Instead, think of it in terms of environment, economy, and culture, things largely outside the monarch's control. Natural forces like drought, famine, good harvests, storms, and long summers and short winters are major factors in the stability of a state, regardless of how the monarch acts. The Jure dynasty adopted the Mandate of Heaven, which meant that disasters were an indication of the emperor losing favor of the gods, and long periods of natural disaster sometimes lead to their overthrow. Likewise, though monarchs can regulate, they can't truly control the economy, where a downturn would often lead to instability, closely paired with famines and drought. And culture, that's a weird one. Though the Queen can influence it, culture is so complex that they can't really control how class, race, sex, religion, and traditions all interact, all of which make for a state stable or unstable. If you want to world build your kingdom to be prosperous or unprosperous, come up with economic, environmental, and cultural reasons why outside the monarch's control. For Fire Lord Sozin, for example, he just happened to rule in a time full of inventors, academics, and good crop harvests. It was a really successful time for the Fire Nation, but how much was Fire Lord Sozin really responsible? But before we go into the summary, today's sponsor.
There are some who call me
Dashlane, and the Wizard is offering you a 30-day free trial of Dashlane Premium, an all-in-one tool to help you secure your passwords and information online, basically speeding up and simplifying travel, shopping, and how I move online, and allowing me to easily respond to security breaches anywhere on my accounts, which it alerts me about. It also has an inbuilt VPN, which is basically required for being online these days. More importantly though, I genuinely wouldn't use them if it meant giving up all of my personal info to Dashlane, but they never have access to any of it. And you can get all of this for less than what it usually costs to get all of these services separately. So at least try it for free. Go over to www.dashlane.com/hellofutureme. All the links are down below. And in summary, firstly, you can have a successive or elective monarchy, consider what equalizing factors or requirements for leadership would change succession, or how the elective monarchy is prevented from becoming hereditary. Either can be constitutional. The question is, what are the interests of those who bind the monarch and which powers matter in your society? Secondly, consider where the de jure and the de facto power lies in your society by asking who controls the wealth, the resources, people, and social capital. Building on this, absolute monarchies are never truly absolute and are always kept in power by those around them. Figure out who those are. Thirdly, consider how communication and control challenges are overcome by your monarch, as well as how other powers or constitutional norms make this difficult. Consider how tax, patronage, and possibly mercantilism stabilize or destabilize the economy of the state. Fourthly, in world building a unique royal court, consider drawing from Asiatic, Arabic, African, or other less familiar models to set yours apart. A good method to build around is finding unique traditions, unique core positions and titles, unique factions vying for power, and a particular focus while other issues are otherwise handled. Fifthly, monarchies don't just collapse because the monarch was terrible, nor does the decline of their power come from necessarily democratic influence. Consider the nature of this tension between monarchical powers and the powers of the rest of society. Who wants what and why? Also that the way your monarchy works does not necessarily reflect the way your society works now. And sixthly, monarchies don't prosper and suffer merely because of a good king or a bad king. Factors in the environment, economy, and culture likely contribute more so despite being outside the monarch's control for the most part. And that's all we've got for monarchies. If you're wondering where all the little references throughout the video come from, it comes from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's a fantastic film, classic comedy. I do really recommend watching it. In the meantime, all links are down below, social media. Come hang out with me. I swear, I'm super funny on Twitter and Instagram. I'm just hilarious. You'll see. No, but really, thank you to all my patrons and everyone else who supports me. I hope that I can be back with another good video in a couple weeks. Should be good. I've got so many videos planned. I wish I could just do all of them right now. Anyways, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.